Jack, the foaming cleanser.
Alka-Seltzer, plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Oh, what a relief it is.
Double your pleasure, double your fun with double mint gum.
J-E-L-L. Oh, the big red letters stand for the Jello family.
Hi, this is Common Point, a show for and about communications. I'm your host, Dan Thomas. A special guest this week is Mark Heiss. Mark is a member of the Vintage Radio and Communications Museum of Connecticut, but Mark also is a specialist in some very interesting areas. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Oh, thanks for inviting me, Dan. Glad to be here today.
Can you give me a little bit about your background?
Sure. Well, my education is electrical engineering. I got a degree from electrical engineering at the University of Hartford, and then went on for a master's degree in computer science. For many years, I designed telecommunications equipment, and now I still work in industry as a project manager.
And you're also a member of the museum. How did that happen?
Like a lot of the volunteers, I came to the museum just to see the collection. In fact, I told my wife, I said, this is going to be a museum of old radios. I said, it'll just be four walls. We'll just stand in the middle of the floor, spin around, look at these four walls, and we'll be out in an hour. John Ellsworth, the founder and director, gave us a tour. We were there for 2 or 3 hours. We ended up seeing only half of the exhibit. We came back the next weekend, spent another 2 or 3 hours to see the balance of it, and I knew that I wanted to be a volunteer there. It really is all the things that I love to play around with.
Now, what is your specialty?
Well, since I was in high school, I collected cylinder phonographs, acoustic phonographs that you crank up, and they have a big horn, a big megaphone, right, painted like flowers. Mm-hmm. And my grandmother gave me her father's cylinder phonograph, and that got me hooked. I liked the novelty of cylinder records, and I started collecting them and the phonographs that they play on. Then when I was in college, my roommate had this desire to own a jukebox, and I used to go around with him to flea markets, and he'd see things in the paper. We'd go look at jukeboxes because he wanted to buy one. Right. So he did eventually buy one. I helped him move it to his house, and that got me hooked, and I became a fan of jukeboxes as well.
Well, I'll tell you what, Mark talks about being a fan of this stuff. I have watched Mark tear apart the greasy motors on these crank-up phonographs, and you pretty much grease from your fingertips to your elbows and those things, but he is a master of redoing those spring motors.
Well, I appreciate that, Dan. They're fun to work on. Every one is an adventure. They're very tricky. Before I work on one, I really have to go find like a reprint of a service manual. Without that service manual, I'd be dead. They're so complicated, so many adjustments that you need that original material to see how they got them working in the first place.
Well, it's amazing considering the time. They're mechanical marvels, really, if you start looking at how they're designed and put together.
They are, and it's a real history when you look at early ones and you follow them through to, say, the late 1980s, where you see everything from purely mechanical machines to combinations of mechanical and relays and vacuum tubes, all the way up to microprocessors.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Now, the jukeboxes. You told us how you kind of got started in that. Mm-hmm. Tell us about your first jukebox.
Well, my first jukebox, I told you that my roommate in college was looking for a machine, and he bought one. And a couple of years later, he found another machine that was made by the same company. It was a different cabinet, but the internals were the same. And he bought it so he could salvage the parts out of it. And he was on his way home, and he stopped by my house. And believe it or not, he had an AMC Hornet station wagon, and he had people lift this jukebox onto the roof. I saw this AMC Hornet with the roof caved in with a 400-pound jukebox on the roof. And he pulled into my driveway and he said, I kind of hate to tear this apart. Would you like it? So I ended up buying it from him, and I still have that jukebox to this day. It's a 1960 AMI.
Now, we call them jukeboxes, or right, juke, which is J-U-K-E, right, boxes. Mm-hmm. But actually, they go by another name.
Yes, the companies are a little inconsistent with what they call those machines. They generally call them automatic phonographs, sometimes coin-operated phonographs, sometimes just phonographs, sometimes coin-operated music machines. They use a lot of different titles, but the one thing that the companies don't call them is jukeboxes. If you look at them and turn them around and look at the nameplate on the back, you never see the term jukebox on those machines.
Now, where did that term come from?
Well, it really came from the speakeasy era during Prohibition, when they'd have one of these machines in the back room of one of these illegal joints where you could get an alcoholic beverage. And in some parts of the country, those establishments were referred to as juke joints. And so that box in the back of the juke joint that played music was referred to as a jukebox. And the manufacturers for many, many years shied away from using that term because it was associated with the illegal establishments.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the history of these automatic phonographs. When did they start?
Well, they really track very well with the history of the phonograph and the phonograph record, right? Because for most of the history of those machines, they played phonograph records. So right around the turn of the last century, when phonographs became available for people to buy for their homes, some ingenious engineers put a coin slot on them and put the machine in a public spot, and people would go up and put a penny in and listen to 1 2-minute song on a record. Of course, it only had one record in the machine, so the likelihood that somebody's going to put another penny in it and listen to the same song a second time was pretty low. So some more ingenious engineers came up with a way of putting multiple records in a machine. Those first machines, you had to listen to it by putting these rubber tubes in your ears. They were hollow rubber, soft rubber tubes to listen to the songs. But as soon as they started putting multiple records in a machine, then they used a Morning Glory horn. Sometimes, a good example of that, there was a machine from 1905 called a multiphone that held 24 cylinders. And it used a big horn hidden behind some fretwork at the top of the machine. But they weren't really loud. You know from being at the museum that a phonograph with a horn on it is louder than probably most people think. But if it was in a restaurant or a bar and there's noise going on, you probably wouldn't hear it very well. So jukeboxes didn't really take off until the tube amplifier came about in the late 20s.
So the late 20s, really, when we started this this trend. Who was the founder? Is there any one particular manufacturer or individual who built the first one?
There were several people that played around with it. Certainly the Edison company had some of those coin-operated single-cylinder machines. Various companies dabbled with it all the way up until the 1920s. In the 1920s, as the popularity of the coin-operated player piano was beginning to wane, those companies that made player pianos just naturally migrated into making jukeboxes. So the big companies like Seeburg, the J.P. Seeburg company, they had made coin-operated pianos and orchestrions. An orchestrion being a player piano that just has other instruments in it, like drums and triangles. The Rudolf Wurlitzer company, they were well known for making musical instruments like band instruments for marching bands, but they also made the famous carousel organs that you see on merry-go-rounds.
And I did not realize that.
And then they got into making jukeboxes as well. I mentioned that I have an AMI at home. Automated Music Inc. was the distributor of the National Piano Company. They made coin-operated pianos, and so again, and then the fourth big name in jukeboxes is a very odd one. It's called the Rockola Manufacturing Company. That had nothing to do with player pianos. They actually made scales, like meat scales you'd have in a deli. But the guy that ran the company, David Rockola, decided right as Prohibition ended to get into making automatic phonographs, and he was quite successful at it.
Yes, and I've heard of Rockola. It's very collectible. Now, as far as collecting, what are the most valuable jukeboxes out there today?
Well, it kind of depends on, like collecting anything, right? It's rarity and how desirable it is, right? What makes a jukebox desirable is lots of colors. Seeing the record play is very important. Spinning wheels, a lot of things that draw your attention to it. Jukeboxes of the 1930s are not so collectible because they tend to be rather, I hate to say it, bland. They're wooden cabinets. They're usually nice veneer wooden cabinets, but there's not a lot that draws your attention. We have a nice 1938 Rockola in our museum, and it actually, I like it quite a lot. But in the world of collecting jukeboxes, it's probably not the most collectible.
Yeah, it's not real exciting.
Right. Well, come about 1940, the manufacturers started putting plastic panels in the corners with light bulbs behind them, and very decorative grill cloth that would reflect the light. And the company that did that best of all was the Rudolf Wurlitzer company. And they started making just some beautiful machines right around 1939 or 1940. Now again, we have a 1940 Wurlitzer in our collection.
Right.
That's one that we restored. And it's very nice to have a machine like that. That is an extremely collectible machine.
Yes, and beautiful.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
In 1946, I'll mention the same guy that designed ours. His name was Paul Fuller. Paul Fuller designed during World War II a jukebox to come out with right after the war. It was the Wurlitzer Model 1015. And that remains to this day the iconic jukebox. I mean, I'd love it if we had one of those on display. We don't. But you'd recognize it immediately. It's a jukebox that has the curved top. It's got bubble tubes that bubble all the way from the feet all the way up around the arch. And if you even go to restaurants today, I mean, some restaurants today have reproduction Wurlitzer 1015s. They're really internet connected now. But that imagery is very, very iconic.
It's fascinating how these came about, because I remember jukeboxes really from the 50s and the 60s and around the 70s and 80s. They evolved, and of course, they evolved initially. They played 78 RPM records.
Right, so our Wurlitzer 700 plays 24 78s. And actually what pushed Wurlitzer out of the #1 position right around 1950 was when the 45 RPM record was introduced, and Seeburg jumped in with both feet.
Wow.
They thought the 45 was going to be a big success. And their competitors held back a little bit. They said, let's see if this 45 takes off. And it did. And of course, with the introduction of rock and roll, and every rock and roll artist was a one-hit wonder in those days, right? Because they were coming out with their first record.
That's right.
And so rock and roll songs were really came out on 45s before they ever came out on albums. So having a machine that would play 45s, that just pushed Seeburg into the #1 position. So when you see something like a 50s, retro 50s show like Happy Days, right? Fonzie goes into Mel's Diner, and what do they have there? They have a 1950s Seeburg jukebox, distinguished with that roll of glass on the top.
Those are beautiful, and I love them. And then the other thing that I remember, as far as we're talking about the history of these, is the ones that were at the booth. You actually had a remote control. In fact, we've got one at the museum where you can sit at your booth and go through the records and select your tunes there. Right.
Well, I'm a volunteer docent at the museum, so I give tours there on Saturdays quite often. And that's a question I get all the time. People will say to me, I remember when they had those little mini jukeboxes next to every table, and they're sometimes surprised when I tell them that those are nothing but a remote control, like a remote control for your TV. It's a coin-operated remote control, but really you're just looking at the titles, putting in a coin, and somewhere else in the restaurant there's the jukebox that's playing that song.
That has the records.
That's right. And of course the speakers are wired through the ceiling, so to the person sitting at the booth it seems like you put the money in and you heard the song coming out of the speaker right above you. So you think you've played a jukebox right there.
How did it evolve? Is there such an animal now?
There is, and the funny part is where most of those companies have gone out of business, one of those companies still remains, and one company name still remains. So the company that still remains is AMI. You could look on the internet. AMI Entertainment is still around, and they make these jukeboxes that hang on the wall. They connect to the internet, and they have a video display on them, and you've got hundreds of thousands of song choices, right? Because you don't have to stock it with records. The other company, Rockola, went out of business in the 1990s, but there was a company in California that made reproduction Wurlitzer jukeboxes, and when Rockola went out of business, they bought the name, And so they now call themselves Rockola Manufacturing. But it's a little weird because they're called Rockola and what they make is reproduction Wurlitzer machines.
Let's talk about the one that you were directly involved with in the restoration. This was not an easy project. And if you tell us about the jukebox, this is the one that we have at the museum that's been completely restored, thanks to Mark and your incredible work on that. But how did that all come about?
Well, I'll just say, like any project that we do at the museum, it's not a one-person task. So maybe I spearheaded it in some ways, but there was a lot of people that contributed to that project. One of our volunteers went to the Brimfield Flea Market. Are you familiar with Brimfield? It's a town right on the Massachusetts border. It turns into one giant flea market several times a year.
I've been there.
And I have a good photograph of the jukebox that we have right now sitting in a flea market booth at Brimfield with a motorcycle in front of it and an old General Electric stove sitting on the other side of it and some hubcaps around it.
Oh my.
And one of our volunteers bought that machine, and on his way home he stopped by the museum realizing he wasn't going to get a 400-pound jukebox up to the third-story apartment that he lived in. So he loaned it to us, and we had it for many years. And you probably remember it sitting there.
Oh, yes.
We wired it up so the light bulbs would light, and that was about it. But it was in pretty rough shape. If you think about how abused a jukebox gets in a bar, people would put cigarettes on the top of it, and the cigarette would burn through, and it would put a big burn mark in the veneer. People would spill drinks on it, plus filthy hands on the front of it for over the course of many years. It was just a wreck. It was really a wreck. Some of the Catalan plastics were broken. Well, the volunteer who owned that machine wanted to move on. He was looking to collect other things, and he wanted to get rid of that machine. And I couldn't bear to see it walk out of our museum because it's such an unusual piece. So John Ellsworth, our founder and director, put out the word to our volunteers and did a fundraiser, and we ended up collecting more money than we expected. In fact, we got enough not only to get the machine, but to fund a restoration project. So what I did is I just took it completely apart till all we had was the wooden cabinet. And the cabinet went to a professional furniture refinisher who did a beautiful job. It's a walnut veneer with a really beautiful finish, and they restored it just like it was new.
Then it's beautiful. It is incredibly beautiful.
At the same time, one of our volunteers took the amplifier home and recapped it. Of course, in those old tube amplifiers, what usually goes is the capacitors dry up, so they did that. One of our volunteers made a heavy-duty metal frame that we could set the mechanism on so we could wheel it around. I mean, that's the heaviest part of the jukebox.
Now, how much does that weigh?
Well, the whole machine is between 300 and 400 pounds.
So it's not lightweight at all.
No, and the cabinet, the wood cabinet really isn't that heavy. It's that mechanism that weighs so much. So there was a couple of pieces that were bent. So I only disassembled the mechanism to the point that I replaced the parts that were bent. I didn't completely take it apart down to the individual gear because that would have made it a significantly longer project. But cleaned it off. One of our volunteers came over to my house. We laid out a tarp in the driveway, and he brought some naphtha, and we had paintbrushes, and we were just painting naphtha on the mechanism, and the old grease was just dripping off of it. You couldn't turn the mechanism no matter how hard you tried. Once we were done, you could turn it with one finger. I mean, the mechanism moves very smoothly.
The mechanics of it fascinate me, and you can see some of the mechanics when you visit the museum.
Sure. What's nice about our museum is when I'm doing a tour of the jukeboxes, I'm happy to swing that door open. You got to get down on your hands and knees and look up to see the mechanism. But I'm happy to show that.
So then, once you got it cleaned, then you needed to find parts.
Yes. And the lucky thing about having worked on jukeboxes all these years is that I have a list of parts people. One very good one, which shut down during the time I was working on the project, but I was still able to go up there and get some parts before he closed his business, was up in Orange, Mass.
Wow.
And I bought a number of parts from him. I bought some parts on eBay, believe it or not. First part I bought, we had the Catalan plastic that is what you see on the exterior.
What is Catalan plastic?
It's like an advancement of Bakelite. So it's a later form of Bakelite that is translucent.
Okay.
It's not quite plastic yet. So it's very thick. It's probably a half an inch or 3/4 of an inch thick, but light passes through it. And they can add some dyes to it, so it gives it little swirly patterns and things. So one of those pieces was broken on our machine, and that would be a very difficult part to find and very expensive. And lo and behold, right as I started the project, somebody put the upper left corner Catalan on eBay, and I bought it from eBay.
And as you mentioned, this is expensive. This is not a $10 piece of plastic.
Right. That was over $100 just for that one part. But I didn't want to pass up on that.
Right, because it was original.
It was original.
Right.
Yeah. So everything on that. Well, I'll say almost everything on that machine is original. There's a couple of trim pieces that all the original ones have shriveled up. So there's a secondary market. People make reproduction pieces for the ones that there are no stock pieces anymore.
How about the grill work on it? I guess you'd call it the beautiful stainless steel or chrome front. What is that?
It is all chrome.
It is.
The one on our machine has an interesting story behind it. Paul Fuller, that designed that machine, he actually designed he was from Switzerland originally, and he designed a Swiss village for the 1939 World's Fair. Oh. And then that same year, he was designing the Wurlitzer Model 700 for Wurlitzer. And so if you look at the chrome grill on the front of that machine, you can actually see some imagery related to the 1939 World's Fair. There's a big circle that represents the perisphere, and two lines that kind of come together in a triangle towards the top of the grill that represent the trilon. So the trilon and perisphere, the central icon of the 39 World's Fair, is kind of worked into the grill of that.
So all in all, it was quite a project. How long did it take?
It took a little more than a year to do. We started taking the machine apart, I would say around November. I can't remember the year now. It was probably 3 years ago. And then worked the entire year. And then we had a great party when we unveiled the machine after the bad winter weather cleared in the spring of the following year. We did a great party.
Yes.
In fact, we had some professional dancers come in, and we played some music from the 1940s, and they were doing period dancing in front of that machine. So I thought that was really nice to see that machine utilized the way it meant to be.
Was originally.
In fact, when the furniture restorers were working on it, they had to turn the cabinet upside down, and a nickel from 1942 fell out of the bottom of the machine. So we even took that nickel and put it on display inside the machine.
Now, we don't have to use money at the museum to play it now.
No, and actually, when a jukebox comes out of service, quite often the companies that own the jukeboxes, they don't want to sell it and take the risk that someone's going to use that machine for making money on their own. So often the companies that pull the machine out of service will take all the coin mechanisms out of them. So when you're collecting jukeboxes, it's always better to find one that has the coin mechanism than to buy one that doesn't have the coin mechanism, because the coin mechanisms are very rare.
Right.
Ours did not have the coin mechanism, and frankly, the money we raised for restoration didn't have enough money in there really to buy all that stuff. It really would have added a lot to the cost. So we have a plate covering where the coins would go in, and it's rigged up so the coin reject button acts as though you're putting a nickel in.
Now, what's the value of that jukebox?
That jukebox is valued in the thousands of dollars. I would guess $3,000 to $4,000. I'm not an expert, honestly, on evaluating them, but I think that's probably a reasonable guess. If you had one that had the coin mechanism and everything else, it could probably approach $4,000 or $5,000. There's other Wurlitzers of the 40s. Some of them go into the $10,000 range, particularly ones that were made during those war years when there were very few of them made, so they're few and far between.
If someone is interested in becoming a jukebox collector, what advice would you give them?
Do a lot of reading about jukeboxes before you go out and buy one, because they are commonly available, but you can get yourself into a lot of trouble by going out and buying a jukebox too soon.
Really?
I mean, everything from the thing could be sitting on a damp floor and have termites in it.
Oh.
You get a jukebox home and it's full of termites, you're really not going to fix it.
Yes.
So you've wasted a lot of money potentially.
Right.
So knowing a little something about the kinds of issues you're going to face, you'd want to be someone mechanically inclined. Otherwise,
Yes.
you've got to hire somebody to fix it for you, and that can be very expensive.
Yeah.
Now, I would liken collecting a jukebox to owning a British sports car. Because they're so old, they almost always need a little bit of TLC.
So there's maintenance involved in
Yes.
these old
Yes.
units as well, even once they're restored.
Yeah, you got to keep them oiled. I mean, I'm guilty. I don't oil mine as often as I should, but you really do have to oil them. And a lot of the grease and oil that are in those machines from when they were new has hardened into the consistency of chewing gum.
Oh,
So you do have to try to clean some of that away. And to do that, you really have to pull the mechanism out, because you don't want to be cleaning that while it's inside the wooden cabinet, dripping everywhere. So it's a challenge.
What about newer jukeboxes, say the 50s and 60s? Are they collectible?
No, not really, because once, about 1964, Seeburg, who was the industry leader, they decided to close up the jukebox and put the mechanism fully inside so that you couldn't see the mechanism anymore. They just decided that seeing the record play was no longer no longer had the appeal that it had in the 40s and 50s. So once 1964 rolls around, they made some fantastic sounding jukeboxes, but there's not a lot to look at. They're low consoles. They just have a sheet of glass with the song labels under them. And if your desire is just to have something to put a lot of 45s in that's going to sound great, that's a bargain, because those can be had for just a few $100s. But as a collectible, they're not really that collectible.
So you really, if you are looking for one in that area, you want to find one that you can still see the records move.
Yeah,
you see the whole mechanism operational.
Yeah, if you wanted to buy one that's going to be an investment that you'll be able to get your money back, seeing the record play is definitely of high importance. Now, we do have at our museum, we have a 1984 AMI. It's just like I described. It's very, very plain looking, just a big panel of glass with the labels under it. I actually have gotten quite used to seeing it. I like that machine.
Yes.
But it really isn't very valuable. Sounds great, handles the records well.
But again.
Right, but not valuable.
So you really, if you're going to do it, if you really want to be a collector, you want to look for one in a wooden cabinet.
Yeah, well, the 50s Seeburgs, even though they are wooden cabinets, a lot of times the sides are painted up. They almost look like they're made out of linoleum. When you look at the sides of them, they usually have decorations on them. So I would say something from the 40s or something from the 50s. 50s being lots of chrome and glass, 40s being wood with the Catalan plastics on it.
Mark Heiss, thank you so much for being our guest today. This has been fascinating. I love talking about the jukeboxes. If you want to see them, Vintage Radio and Communications Museum, then they play.
And they all work.
Beautiful.
They all work, so we can demonstrate them to anyone that comes.
Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here.
It was a lot of fun. For the Common Point program, I'm Dan Thomas, and thank you for watching.
Cola, it's the spot, 12 full ounces, that's a lot, twice as much to do. Pepsi Cola is the drink for you. Nickel, 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 nickel. Pepsi Cola hits the spot, 12 full ounces, that's a lot, twice as much for a nickel too. Pepsi Cola is the drink for you.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.